Hello and welcome to Blackwork Embroidery with Amelia of the Shire of Trinovantia Nova. This class is going to look at the four main stitches of the two styles we call blackwork, as well as a quick intro into why there are two styles of blackwork. So let's begin. We have first counted blackwork embroidery, which is best known from paintings of Holbein, typically of the court around the time of Catherine of Aragon, and a little later. These ones, for instance, are from a painting of, I believe, Jane Seymour. I should look that up. They're her cuffs, and the pattern has been charted by many others, but I was really trying to focus on getting the edging right. This double-headed eagle is also seen on a pair of, I think, Venetian breeches, with Italian phrases in these little bubbles here, that then you can work on other little habits there. Sometimes it's nice to start on Aida cloth because then you can really see what you're doing, and the pattern will show up a little bit bigger. This is an even weave linen that is meant for embroidery. Quick note that if you are using a non-even weave or just a regular linen fabric, it is beautiful to embroider on, but the warp and the weft will not be the same. So if you're expecting a square, you'll either have to do some math or you will have to accept the fact that it's not going to be square. But the other thing I wanted to show is that the nice thing about counted embroidery is that it's really easy to chart using graph paper. And so you can easily chart out the movements of the stitches. Usually it's one stitch going over either one or two threads in along the threads or in a diagonal. And then if you like a pattern and think, I want to change that just a little bit, you can do that when you're charting, and then that's really easy to change on your stitching. While I have it here, the back side of blackwork is not identical to the front, no matter what the paintings tell you and no matter what the Victorians tell you. However, it's usually really similar, especially if it's done using this double running or Holbein stitch. However, your back sides can be a little messy, especially before you, like if you don't clean up your ends of thread, then you can have a somewhat messy back. You can also use those threads to tie in so that you don't end up with knots on the back. I'm not too fussed about my knots. This is just my practice piece. So counted work. There's also non-counted line work. This is also called blackwork because it is frequently done with black using the same kind of linear technique. So here we have a Burberry pattern done in stem stitch, and then it has some seed stitch fill. And this is the reason why we have the two different styles is because the more geometric style, which then got applied to organic, more lifelike patterns, existed coming from the Spanish style of embroidery, as well as England already had a rich linear embroidery with natural motifs. So then they just married the two, but both styles are called blackwork. Incidentally, oh dear, I've dropped my piece. If it's done in red or pink, sometimes it's called red work. It's still blackwork. Both of these are done in a stem stitch, so they're actually the exact same style of embroidery. However, you will notice, both with the non-counted and with the counted, that sometimes it's a bit maze-like and it can be tricky to decide how you want to follow your lines around. So that's something that we'll work on. But today we're worried about the stitches. Excuse me while I move these out of the way. So this is more stitches than we need. Today we're going to focus on a double running stitch called a Holbein stitch or a punto scritto. A writing stitch. There's also a back stitch, which is used very commonly in more modern work, and honestly, if we're not going to see the back of your work and you like backstitch better than double running, go right ahead. An outline or a stem stitch, it's an outline stitch if when you're moving from left to right, it goes from the bottom to the top, and it's a stem stitch if it goes from the top to the bottom. I wouldn't worry too much about the names, so long as you choose whatever's going to work best for you. Then there's a chain stitch, which is sometimes used for line work, especially when using metallic threads. And then sometimes people use split stitch for this. I'm not going to worry about it today. So we're going to start out today using some Aida cloth because hopefully you'll be able to see my stitches really well. So I've already done a few stitches of running stitch. I think we all kind of grasp how that's going, over and under. Now I'm going to go back the other way over what I've done. So I'm going to come up, and now I have a choice. If I'm not going to split the stitch that I did before, because there's already a bit of thread occupying that little hole, if I'm not going to split that, then I ought to decide whether I'm coming from the top or the bottom so that my stitches can angle a little bit and not end up sort of laddering. So this is nice and simple when we have just a single line. Then we can look at what happens when maybe we branch off that line. So I'm just going to take myself away from here a little bit. And let's say that I'm going to, dear. So I'm referring to a pattern I can see just beside me. Nope, that's not where that goes. There it is. Okay, now usually, here's where you're going to see if my stitches step. Usually when I do a sort of branching out segment off of the main line, I like to come back immediately to retrace my steps so that I don't get lost. And then that way when I come back to finish up all my main lines, I should know where I am. Otherwise, if you just have a bunch of half-finished stitches, it's very easy to get lost. So let's just do the one, not take forever on it. And then I'll finish back this way. We can see this little tongue, I guess. It doesn't look like that in the whole version of it, but the important part is just to not get lost. So that's our double running stitch, otherwise known as a holbein stitch or a punto scritto. However, there are other ways to do this. We can also do a back stitch. Now, back stitch, we're going to go back and then go ahead along our line of stitching and go back again, and ahead along our line of stitching and go back again. So I think we're getting the idea. Come up ahead and go back again. Just to see the back side of this, that double running stitch should look very similar front to back. And I don't know if you can see that there's a little more thread on the back of the back stitch. So it uses a bit more thread as well. That's also why the double holbein, or the double running or holbein stitch is really nice if you're using a fine silk thread that maybe you don't have as much of. It uses the same amount top and bottom. But there are other stitches that use more on the top than on the bottom. So if we're doing a non-counted version, then we might want to do an outline or stem stitch. I'm going to do this on the counted thread first. So I have my thread held above just so that you can see what's happening here. And then I'm going to come up along this line and then go down ahead. And I'm holding my thread above. And I go down ahead. And I'm holding my thread above. So this makes a slightly doubled line on the top, and actually something very like a back stitch on the back. So this is very nice if you are working a line work and you'd like it to have a little bit of oomph. Then stem stitch or outline stitch is really pretty. Now, that's where we don't do what I do. I always like to try to leave myself a little bit of thread up at the top so that I can see whether I'm going up or down, and so that I don't split my stitches. But we don't want to do stem or outline. We do have another option. I don't use this one nearly as much in my black work, but I still do use it in some line work embroidery, again, especially when I'm working with gold. So let's talk about chain stitch, where if you can count your threads, you may as well go in and out in the same hole. Sorry, this gets a little bit fussy. So I'm moving one ahead along that line. The tricky part with chain stitch is to try to keep your tension even so that your chains end up the same. Obviously, my tension is not entirely the same. And then when you finish your chain stitch, it's very important to close it off with a tacking stitch. So you end up with something that looks an awful lot like back stitch on the back, but you have a nice thicker line on the top that can be really nice when you're doing line work. So putting this aside for a moment, I wanted to look at what happens if we have something that is more of an even weave, although a thicker one. And I was thinking for this, I might like to do a stem stitch. So I have drawn my pattern on, and when I'm not doing a counted piece, I will typically draw my pattern onto my fabric. And again, when you don't have stitches to count, it's up to your eyes to try to keep your stitches even. And it can sometimes be a bit tricky if you have a very wide or very heavy weave like this and a somewhat delicate pattern, to try to not let the weave of the fabric make it wonky. But handwork sometimes is. Let's just see what we end up with. How about I pause and go ahead?